We're delighted to have a terrific second panel here for our BBTI event. We have Toria Newland, who is a colleague here at Brookings. Constanta Stelzmüller, also a colleague here at Brookings. Walter Russell-Mead, who is at the Hudson Institute, and Benjamin Haddad, who is at the Atlantic Council. And I will allow you all to read their bios in the handout, but just to save time, I think we'll get right into it. And what we wanted to do in this session was really to look at the US-Europe dimension, but to ask a question, which is, if we look ahead to 2021, whether there's a change in administration or second term of President Trump, what type of Atlantic relationship can we envisage? I mean, are we likely, whoever wins, to have some recurrence of the differences and tensions over defense spending and trade and economic issues, and sort of the gap between a European mindset and American mindset that may be defined not just this administration, but also partly the last administration? Or can we envisage a much deeper form of cooperation in an era of, a clash of systems between authoritarianism and democracy, and that Europe and the United States might be able to find a constructive agenda? So we want to try to sort of, I guess throughout, we'll get into Trump and Europe and maybe the Democrats in Europe and Europeans' view of America later on. But Walter, if I could start with you, if that's okay, and get your sort of take on whether or not you think that these sort of tensions and problems are overcomable, or I think, as you've sort of written, that there is really a fundamental sort of problem here, and that it's unlikely to go away.
Well, look, I think that actually both of those points are right. There's a fundamental problem that's unlikely to go away, but there are also forces driving us together. And in some ways, I think that a lot of the problem that we're seeing in Europe and in the transatlantic relationship and in the functioning of other international institutions in general is that we've entered a much more fluid and rapidly moving international environment. If you think about the Cold War era or the post-Cold War era, one of the interesting things is how fixed the international system seemed to be, how slowly alliances changed, how incremental things were, which is, in some contrast to the way things were before, say, 1948, and again, I think now. And so we're seeing a crises of institutions, crises of institutional functioning, and sort of an ideological crisis among people who have identified successful diplomacy and successful international action with the development of institutions along a kind of preordained track. It's interesting for me to look at to contrast that with, say, the relationship among, the sort of England, Canada, United States, Australia, New Zealand, which is much less institutionalized. There's no secretariat really of these countries. There's no treaty that really binds them. And yet and they often disagree and they don't act unanimously. Yet over time, because of kind of structural similarities in interests and culture, they end up on the same side of a lot of issues. And out of that has come a certain institutional coordination and so on. And my optimistic nature, which is actually quite strong, thinks that while the transatlantic relationship isn't quite as easy as that, it is still a very strong and deep one. And that even when, that what Germany and the United States aren't seeing China in somewhat similar ways because there's an institutional coordination or a lot of ideological agreement. It's just that they're patterns of interest and culture. So I think we're going to see both continued friction and continued sort of dysfunction and discomfort as institutions try and sometimes succeed and sometimes fail to adjust to new realities. but also continuing ways in which our common interests and values, we look at something like what's been going on in Hong Kong in the last couple of days, and we all sort of spontaneously think very similar thoughts about it. So, a mix.
Thank you. Toria, if we could turn to you next, I mean, what would be the challenges in trying to build on those common interests? I mean, we always say that there are these shared interests and shared values, but, there have been, if you look back over the last 20 years, we maybe never quite sort of achieved the heights of cooperation that experts on the outside say should be sort of natural. And so if there is a different president, or if President Trump has an epiphany and all of a sudden wants to work with the European Union, how hard would it be to sort of operationalize a very different, sort of deeper agenda of cooperation to deal with these new problems that we face?
Well, I think we do best always as a liberal democratic family, and I don't just mean the transatlantic family, I also mean with Asian allies and with our oceanic allies, et cetera, when we focus on common problems. And frankly, the problems that challenge all of us on both sides of the Atlantic, on both sides of the Channel, on the other side of the Pacific, are common. It is just that we are not addressing them in common. We are fracturing our own family even as we articulate common problems. So take China, for example. You've got a very ambitious China, potentially aggressive China across the board. It makes absolute sense that rather than the United States trying to deal with the trade challenges with China by itself, it should be allying with other democracies, first and foremost in Europe, but also in Asia, in making the same kinds of open market, WTO compliant requests, demands of China, using our own markets, but also protecting ourselves and setting left-right limits on Chinese investment so that we're not losing strategic heights, losing strategic assets. So that is an example where the logic of not simply common values but common interests ought to put us together. Then you can leverage the various structures, the bilateral relationships, the multilateral institutions, everything from US-EU to NATO-EU to the UN to the WTO, in service of a set of objectives. Similarly, we failed to deal with the disruptive Russia in its effort to undermine democracy, which is something that all of us are facing. It ought to be relatively straightforward, but I don't think it happens without U.S. leadership and without the U.S. Asking the democratic family to work together and using the various institutions, hub and spoke, et cetera, to create common policy. But it ought to be relatively straightforward to expose what Russia is doing, to protect and educate our citizens against it, to set up countermeasures, et cetera. But we have failed to do that because on our side, we're either not going at all, or we're going it alone, or we're somehow believing that we are constrained when we work with others. Yes, there's always an element of constraint when you work with others, but there's also a force multiplying effect and a legitimizing effect to U.S. policy. So, I think I hope we've hit a nadir in terms of trying to address our own problems, whether it is Iran or China, or we're, as I said, not addressing Russia at all, trade, growing our own economy so that we can address demands of the middle class, dealing with artificial intelligence by ourselves, and we will come back, however you define it, whether it's nation state to nation state, and then using the institutions, or institutions the other way around, to working more together. And if we don't, I think we're not going to, as the previous panel made clear, we're going to provide space for illiberals to take a route on us and change the rules of the game. And we're also not going to address the demands of our citizens to live better, live more securely, live with more justice, live with more unity.
Thank you. Ben, if we could turn to you. You have a new piece with Alina, my colleague here in Foreign Affairs, on titled Europe Alone. But you argue that Europe should pursue more autonomous capabilities, that European autonomy is in American interests. But you also argue, that Europe is sort of weaker than the US and that ultimately the transatlantic relationship won't be as central to US strategy. So as you hear this, that, the US should sort of focus more on Europe and build up sort of this, deep partnership, are you skeptical? I mean, do you think basically that's, really not going to happen and Europe has to sort of focus on its own sort of region, or do you, where do you see this sort of headed over the medium to long term?
Last week we celebrated in France and Normandy the 75th anniversary of D-Day, and President Trump was in France. And a lot of the media coverage on both sides of the Atlantic was how, we've lost these great bonds, this great transatlantic moment, and there was a lot of nostalgia for it. But, we should also celebrate that. We should celebrate the fact that D-Day is our past. And what Europe is today, Europe whole and free, reconciled, that is not the centrality of U.S. interest, and should be celebrated. It's a testament to American victory. It's a testament to the success of the transatlantic relationship. And so I think nostalgia is a poor guide. The truth is, yes, Europe is not as central to American worldview as it was in the 1940s and as it was in the years that followed. And once again, that's good news, and certainly good news for a French citizen. The question is, where do we go from there? So I'm not necessarily skeptical, but I think if you think, is Europe the theater of U.S. foreign policy? I think the last two presidents with very different worldviews have signaled that in very explicit ways. President Obama with the pivot to Asia, and President Trump by also focusing on China. Then the other question is, is Europe a partner for the United States? And then the question is for Europeans to prove that they can be a partner. I think for American elites to understand as well that, for example, in the rivalry to come with China, if it's about shaping norms of globalization, of trade, of privacy, artificial intelligence, yes, you're much stronger with the largest single integrated market on your side, with the main norm setter of trade. But it's also for Europeans to make that case. And, one of the things that we wrote with Lena, and we've written various articles about this, is that there's been so much focus for very obvious reasons here in Washington and in European capitals on the president, his personality, his rhetoric, his tweets. And it's true that a lot of the things that he's pushing, calling the European Union a foe or imposing tariffs, I think we won't see this in the future administration. This is really linked to his personality and some of his obsessions in the last few decades. But that's not what's interesting. What's interesting is to look at structural trends and things that are deeper. If you look at the previous president, the focus on burden sharing was already there. And the demand for Europeans to invest more in their own defense was there. Once again, the focus on Asia was already there, and so when I hear that we face common challenges and have common interests, it is true, but to a certain extent. I'll give you a very specific example: Syria. This crisis has been treated by the last two administrations as a faraway humanitarian tragedy on which the United States had very little leverage, and clearly the American public did not want to get more involved, was still traumatized by Iraq. When President Obama decided not to strike after the famous red line, I think it was criticized by a lot of people, including myself and DC think tanks, but he was supported by 60% of American public opinion, and we have to respect that. But this crisis was not a faraway tragedy for Europeans. De facto, it was an existential crisis for the institutions of Europe, from the refugee crisis of 2015 to the rise of ISIS and terrorist attacks all over Europe. Salvini would not be where he is without Syria. These foreign policy crises had a major impact on shaping European societies. And so we have as Europeans, we have two ways. Either we can just say, the last two American presidents were not Atlanticist enough, were not interventionist enough, and if only we had someone who was a little more committed to our own security, or we can decide to take matters on our own hands. I do not think at all this is detrimental to the transatlantic relationship. I actually think America should embrace and welcome and encourage a more assertive, more autonomous European partner. I'm very aware that this is a generational effort, and we're long away from it, and we're very divided right now. But this is in America's interest, and this will mean, and this is what we write, probably a more difficult relationship to navigate on both sides. We do have sometimes different worldviews. We have different values. The previous panel talked about how the environment is becoming more and more a concern in European public opinions, and clearly, disagreements over the Paris Agreement are something that is taken seriously by Europeans. But America should welcome a partner that can act on its own. That is the value of an ally, and that is, I think, the definition of a more mature relationship in the long run.
Thank you. Constanza, the president has let's say, a skeptical attitude toward the EU, but it's really nothing compared to his attitude toward Germany, which seems to be rooted in, I don't know, there's some psychological thing there, but there's also a trade thing there, and there's a personality thing with Merkel, and it's sort of make Germany bad again seems to be the message of the message. So you've been advocating sort of very passionately for transatlantic cooperation, for European autonomy, Europe to do more over the last sort of 5 years here and before. But I'm just wondering your reflections, and just engage, I guess, what's been raised so far, but also your reflections on the trajectory of this. I mean, President Obama had a good relationship with Merkel, a good relationship with Germany. Seems really to have changed. How worried are you that it can't be sort of put back on a constructive track? I didn't mean to.
I'm tempted to ask whether I can throw the question to the audience, but I guess not. All right, America, Germany. Look, I think we saw both in Merkel's appearance at the Munich Security Conference in February and in the Harvard commencement speech that she has decided to accept the fact that neither she nor Germany are popular with this administration, and we're just going to have to roll with it. I think that that's a fairly sane attitude to take. The larger problem I have with both her appearances and I think this ties into what Benjamin was just saying, is that I think that while it's okay to say, look, if you don't like us, that's tough, we're going to have to cooperate anyway, you realize that, and now let's talk about the stuff that really matters. I think that, and I worry that the European approach so far is a little bit short on prescription. Yeah? Let me sort of give a somewhat larger strategic framework to what I'm attempting to say here, which is the following. We are confronted for the first time post-1945 with an American administration that seems hell-bent on restating the framing of the international order as an order that ideally ought to be composed by strong sovereign nations who cooperate with each other, but which is going to be deinstitutionalized, denormativized, and it's clear that neither the United Nations, nor NATO, nor the EU are particularly popular in this context, all right? I think that is a genuine problem for Europe, because all of these institutions have been good for peace, prosperity, stability, and democratic transformation, not just in Europe, but elsewhere. And I think the time of liberal hubris, where we thought, the trajectory of the West and of the world was going to be one of linear progress, that time is long over. I mean, we've been engaging in beating our chests for quite a while now and admitting that mistakes were made. But I think for most of us, the notion of throwing all that out and replacing it with a notional, and to my mind, fantastical, order composed of strong sovereign states at a time when globalization is still doing to us what it does is just fantastical. And so I think what we have to do, really, is to, as Europeans, and here I agree completely with Ben, we have to be much, much stronger in proposing alternatives and in making our case why we think that these norms, these institutions, these arrangements are still good, and not just for us, but also for America. And that America ultimately is engaging in an act of self-harm if it tries to denigrate and disassemble all this.
Thank you. Victoria, yeah.
Just to jump into that, you know, for those of us on the U.S. side who watched with concern and, in some cases, horror as our own nation turned on the system that we built, the alliances that we built, the free market traditions that undergird it, the shared security space that undergirds it, I think there was a hope that there would be at least one Václav Havel, Margaret Thatcher, European champion who would stand up and make, first and foremost to Europeans, but also globally, the case for liberal, open systems to produce the best economic and security and values results for their individual populations, but then the pooling of that effort multilaterally to lift all boats, including those for citizens who don't necessarily live in liberal countries, and we just haven't seen it. You know, my disappointment with Merkel's Munich speech and her Harvard speech were that she had an opportunity to remind everybody why we built what we built after 1949, what it has brought us in terms of prosperity and security, and what is at risk. You don't have to love the EU as an institution to understand that when 28 sovereign nations can come to a common way to address a problem that keeps the world open, that keeps security pooled, we all do better. And when they fail at that, as they have on immigration, as they have in filling the gaps in the Eurozone system, we all suffer. So, you know, my biggest worry now is not too much Europe, it's too little Europe, and it's the centrifugal forces that we are encouraging within Europe itself, resulting in no good solutions to any of these problems, either individually or collectively.
Thank you. Walter, if I could turn to you just to reflect on what Toria just said, but also you had an article in the Wall Street Journal recently in which you, I think, tried to tap into what the Trump administration was thinking about the EU, maybe not the president himself, but you know, people around him in terms of their critique. And you sort of laid out, I thought very interestingly, a series of arguments that they would make as to why the EU is not in America's interest. I'd love to, you know, just get your take on what reaction you got to that, and what you think is going on in the administration. Is this a long-term thing? But also, you know, do they sort of understand, I guess, that, you know, a lot of these forces they're empowering in Europe are not actually pro-American. You know, they tend to be sort of close to Putin, close to the Russians, you know, will want to work with the Chinese. They have sort of a history that is not, it's not sort of, you know, the center-right conservatism here or even in Europe. It's not Thatcher, it's something remarkably different. And what's their answer when you talk to them about this, about sort of the end game?
Well, I do think that, I mean, you know, first of all, their view of some of these regimes is I think, short-sighted. You know, you try to describe what people think. That's not the same thing as agreeing with it.
Yeah, I know.
And, you know, I think the real concern from an American point of view is that the EU is decohering enough on its own. It doesn't really need any help from us. But I think the sense of inevitability of the decline of this institutional framework for international politics is probably the force that binds a lot of these folks together. They look and, you know, Does China have any interest whatever in going a sort of path that the EU or American Atlanticists would think is good? No. Does Russia? No. Does India? Not really. Does Turkey? No. And is it realistic to think that you can impose or even nudge that? They would probably not only say no, but say that they thought that actually America can live with this better than Europe can, and that they need that it's better for America to roll with these punches. And that, I think, I mean, these are statements about the future. One doesn't know if they're true or not, but it's a very high-risk approach. And one of the things that is clear about this administration is that there are a lot of things that all of us took for granted as sort of taboos and barriers that can't be broken, and they just don't care about them. They think that, in a sense, again, I think they think they don't. If this were 1975 or 1985, many of the people would continue to roll along in the old environment. But they just don't think it's possible. So for that reason, they're trying to sort of not be limited in their own imagination. Will it work? I think the reality is that if they're right, if this is the way the world is going, we are headed for a much more tumultuous and dangerous era of world politics for all the reasons that Constanza, these institutions, if we're going to say these institutions once worked and no longer work, we're saying there's a terrible historical tragedy taking place.
But I'm not saying that.
But no, I'm not. I know you're not saying they're not working, but I'm saying the things that you say, I agree with you 100% about the value that these institutions at one point contributed, and and one would hope would continue to be able to contribute. The question the question is whether they can.
So I want to bring both of you in and Ben next. I mean, just one reflection on what Walter just said. I mean, I'm sort of struck sometimes that, I've written as well that the EU has these weaknesses and is sort of exposed. But one of the interesting stories of the last 5 years is the European Union's strength. Like they basically, won the Brexit negotiation. I don't think that was obvious at the beginning. That it revealed greater EU power. The trade negotiations with the US sort of there was a ceasefire in place partly because they were deterred. So it's an interesting sort of case where there's weakness and strength. But Ben, I wanted to sort of ask you, I mean, I think it's fair to say you've engaged quite a lot here with both sides of the spectrum, but also with conservatives on Europe, and you've been writing about that. And I'm just would love to get your sort of assessment of, Walter talked about the discussion inside the White House and inside the administration. What are you sort of seeing in the, conservative sort of foreign policy community more generally? Is there a sea change on the EU when you sort of make your argument that the EU is in America's interests and the EU should have this autonomous capability? What sort of reaction do you get, and where do you think it's headed? I mean, are we likely to see the partisanship of U.S. policy toward Europe, with Democrats basically saying, EU integration is good and Republicans saying it's bad, or will it be more traditional, more of a consensus with some dissenters?
It's an interesting question because I do think there's a form of schizophrenia on the conservative side because if the president tomorrow wanted to withdraw from NATO, he would have 99 senators opposing it. Maybe only Rand Paul would support it. But Brexit was supported by many Republican senators because they thought the question that was being asked is, would you want the United States to be part of the European Union? But it's not the question. The question is Brexit in America's interest? And it's not. It's a direct win for Russia. It's a direct hit to American interest in Europe. Britain was the key ally and partner of the European Union, of the United States within the European Union, to the great distress of the French. But they see, a bureaucracy, regulation, transnational norms, all the things that basically conservatives stand against. But it's a foreign policy question. It shouldn't be about ideology. It should be about, are we better off with a united and strong European Union as a partner? So I think previous American presidents, including Republicans, have understood this. And clearly there's something amongst certain people in the administration, and Constanza also has written about this, there is a more ideological approach. I'd like to go back to what Walter said about whether, if the world of institution is really in decline, it's a historical tragedy. And it's a historical tragedy for no one more than Europeans. Because this liberal hubris that Constanza talked about, this Fukuyama moment in the 90s, the end of history, no region and no political power has built itself and its identity on this more than the European Union. Remember, this was, why Europe will rule the 21st century, because basically we're ahead of everyone else. We're a postmodern power. Everyone's going to catch up on us, and it's all going to be about norms, multilateralism, and cooperation. And now we're basically stuck between Trump and Xi Jinping, and it's a very difficult moment for us, because how do we keep what makes our model original, and at the same time make ourselves able to compete in this world? And I do agree with you that you have some good news. You have you can sense with Brexit, or even with Trump, or even with some of the vocabulary that's used by Europeans right now in China, systemic rival, by the European Commission, the investment screening scheme, there is a sort of slow awakening to the reality of power politics. And it is necessary. It's going to be a very difficult moment for Europeans, because you need to be able, the European Union was basically built on this idea that we want to replace conflict by norms, technical cooperation, economists. This is what has led to, moments of tensions like Ukraine, where we were negotiating a free trade association agreement with Ukrainians, which we saw as economically beneficial for everyone, whereas Ukrainians saw it as a great opportunity to anchor their country to the West. They saw it as something strategic and political. Russians saw it as a threat, and no one was thinking strategically about this in Europe. And I think, the last few years are basically forcing Europeans now to think strategically. And as much as I've been very critical of Europeans for their inability to do this, it is very important for us to keep this model for two reasons. I mean, the first one is because cooperation in our globalized world, exactly as Constanza said, is necessary to tackle the challenges that we're facing, from the environment to migration to financial crisis. The migration crisis 2015 has proven that the Mediterranean is the border of Germany and Sweden. We need cooperation on this. And the second reason is, what can France, Germany, or Hungary do on its own today between the United States and China? It's absolutely obvious that in the 21st century, you do need to be united. It's going to be much harder to navigate. But, the Belgian Prime Minister, Paul-Henri Spaak, used to say, every European country is small, only some of them don't know it yet. And it's still the case. So we do need this, but it's going to be a much harder path to navigate for Europeans than it is, I think, for the United States.
Thanks. Constanza?
Well, I'll come in right on the back of that. I think that a lot of this obsession with sovereignty and control, I think, to me, as a friend of America, as a really warm, close, affectionate friend of America, looks like an extended nervous breakdown over the fact that America, too, has become less powerful in a world of deep economic integration. And of course, there is no economic area with which America is more deeply integrated than with Europe. And so ultimately, threats of a trade war with Europe, acting on those threats, simultaneous security brinksmanship in regions around Europe, all are things, and never mind enabling the Orbans of this world or the Salvinis, all these are things that increase the risk levels for Europe enormously, but also are an act of self-harm for America. And I think that this obsession with sovereignty and control and getting rid of norms and institutions and so on, it risks obscuring that fundamental fact that America needs to have a foreign and security policy that is based on the existence of globalization rather than suggesting it's all some kind of a fever dream that we just need to wake up from.
Thank you. Toria, let's turn to Britain for a second, because Brexit may be one of the biggest events to happen in Europe in decades. How should we've seen a lot, and Amanda in the previous panel discussed what has happened to date and what might happen in October. But by 2021, there will be some sort of clarity. Like there probably will be a Brexit of some description. I think it's.
You don't think we kick the can to 2030 or
I think
2045?
I think the success of Farage, I think, has reminded Tories that it's an existential threat to them if they don't deliver some form of Brexit. Now, it may be, a form of Brexit that, is not very advantageous for them, and maybe they rethink later on. But I guess my base case is they are out of the EU formally by 2021. Maybe that won't happen. But let's just say that it for the sake of argument, that it did happen. What should the United States do to mitigate the negative effects of that for Britain, for the EU, and for the transatlantic relationship as a whole? Or, is this really just an internal matter for Britain and the EU that the US has very little role on?
Well, first of all, just to say that to remind with as little arrogance as I can muster here that the United States has, throughout the post-war period, played a mediating role among European states whenever they've had difficulties. And what we should have done, and helped glue Germany and France, and helped convince Western Europe that Eastern Europe was worth having, and all of those kinds of things. Enlargement, right, that's what I'm saying, yeah. And also helped set a common policy towards Russia, a common policy towards Middle East, et cetera. So, I think part of this centrifugal stuff that we see coming is that we are not having this permanent conversation that we've been having since 1948 at least, about how the liberal family holds together, what we believe in, how we take good care of each other, how we avoid crashing. You remember that when the economic crisis hit, we would have lost Italy, we would have lost Greece, we would have lost Spain, potentially others, if we hadn't had a very aggressive conversation, not only within Europe, but between the United States and Europe and the international financial institutions. So that takes you to the fact that I think we could have played a moderating, mediating role across the channel in this period, and that was what we were trying to set up to do. I am not among those, much as it is a tragedy to lose the UK's voice inside the EU, for the United States, for the EU, for openness, for all of those things. I'm not among those who think it needs to be an existential global crisis to have the UK outside of the EU. You could end up with an affirmative three-legged stool between the US, the UK, and the EU that achieves a lot of the same effect of keeping markets open, addressing problems from tech and digital to China to Russia to, a fracturing Middle East. But it would have it required, and it still requires, that the open market system, both across the Channel and across the Atlantic, be perpetuated, and that free movement be perpetuated, and that you have a dispute resolution mechanism that everybody can live with. So those are the three pieces. So I am still hopeful that we won't have a crash out. We'll have a way to deal with this. If we had succeeded, and I hope we get back to it, with the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, you would have set the ground rules of open trade among us, and then presumably the divorce would have happened within that envelope. So we need a velvet divorce. We need a divorce with as little economic turbulent impact as possible. So what I'm worried about most now is an economic slowing in Europe, where you have Italy already in recession, you have Germany not growing, you have a lot of the South teetering. the UK, who knows, could precipitate a larger global challenge, including for the United States, and we don't have the trust and goodwill among ourselves to deal with it collectively. But I'm also worried that out of a more violent Brexit, or a less consensual Brexit, or a less open market Brexit, you end up with a much smaller UK. You end up not with Great Britain, but with Little England having to deal with a shrinking economy, with a shrinking global role, with challenges to maintaining its traditional rule-setting role, on both sides of the channel, on the other side of the channel and with us and globally, and they'll be obsessed with survival, and that's not good for us either.
Thank you. Anyone else want to come in on Brexit, just in response, or should we go to the audience?
I'll just quickly, I think, say that I would agree with Toria that, traditionally in any presidency, any U.S. presidency, certainly before 2001, the idea that the Prime Minister of the UK was going to try to negotiate with the EU and then take the result of that to a referendum in the UK over membership in the EU would have been treated as a major national security issue, one that demanded the absolute highest sort of engagement of the United States. And it didn't. I mean, not out of any, and at that point, because we were really talking about the Obama administration, not out of ideological hostility. And it was clear that President Obama, he did go to the UK and make a speech urging them to vote yes, which is probably not the wisest way to get foreign citizens to do something, is to tell them that you think they should do it. But in any case, it just didn't register. And I think this powerfully backs up Ben's point that in the Syria discussions, the idea that a massive dislocation of millions of people who were close to Europe could create a political crisis that would shake Europe to its core, wound Angela Merkel and really reduce her opportunities to lead indefinitely, further polarize North and South, fuel populism. It didn't register in the United States government that this was a major thing. And during the Cold War, often when Americans looked around the world, when anything happened anywhere in the world, we thought, okay, what does this mean for Europe? That's no longer, that link has been broken in the sort of community of American foreign policy thinkers, whether on the left or on the right. Now, there are still some people in both parties who are trying to maintain that kind of high engagement. But in neither party are they consistently or even frequently able to win policy victories. And I think that's, that is a fact about U.S.-European relations. Maybe it can change, but right now it is a fact. And we all have to be thinking about what does that fact mean, and it does. And I think Ben is right here that it means, among other things, that Europeans have to think much harder about what it is they want to achieve and what their vital interests are.
Consent, you want to come in quickly?
I just want to sort of add one point, I think, to illuminate a little more starkly the divides that we're talking about. This is the first American government that has, in which significant players espouse a faith-based ethno-nationalism as the framing for global affairs. That is just a completely new world for transatlantic relations, and I don't think any of us have completely factored that in yet. But it is, I think, at least as divisive as the security brinksmanship and as the weaponization of economic interdependence that's going on right now. And I think we're only about to see those three things play out, but I would urge you to not underestimate the ideological point that I've just described.
Great. we will go to the audience. Let's take three questions at a time, maybe. This gentleman here, and then Jeff, and then we'll back. Yeah. So just say your name and be sure to ask a question.
Hi, I'm Gabriel Barnett. I'm a student at the University of Pennsylvania. I was just wondering if you think the backsliding of democracy in Poland and Hungary, if that's registering, if anyone in the policy community is really talking about that as a major issue of U.S. national security interests, things like that. Thank you.
Thanks. Jeff. Yep.
Just on the question of Jeff Stacey, one of the many people on the Russia group of the Clinton campaign who was hacked by the Russians, and that relates to the question that I have about your search for a new cause célèbre for U.S. Western grand strategy. It seems like not just normal people, but even all the elites, former top officials in previous administrations on both sides of the aisle, all of us, have missed what Mueller described as the systematic, across-the-board takedown that the Russians in their cyber warfare against the U.S. and others have achieved. Aren't we missing something in Central Europe, something new, that the populists are on their heels in some key places? There are protests everywhere in Central Europe right now, even in Hungary, even in Poland. The Romanians just threw their guy in jail. Bulgaria started this. Slovakia, this woman, this extraordinary new prime minister of Slovakia, beat all the loud, as she put it, the loud populists. So populists are bad governors, but all of them are doing this, including the EU elections, this extraordinary turnout for the European Parliament in the face of massive, systematic Russian interference. Isn't that the new cause célèbre that we're looking for to really put our finger on and show the extent of this interference, which is really cyber warfare against all of us? And even in the face of that, the Central Europeans are starting to win. Maybe that's where we need to be looking. Is there something possibly to that?
Great question. Thank you. And we'll take, why don't we've only got a couple of hands up, so why don't we take the remainder and then we can go to our panel. So I think there were two people down the back. So this gentleman here, yeah.
Hi, my name is Nicholas Kunzig. I just recently graduated from American University. My question was about about European autonomy and whether the European Commission is allowed to, or should be allowed to, allow companies to merge so that they can better compete with state-sponsored corporations in China or large corporations in the US. Even though that might actually, those companies would be better able to compete with foreign companies, but that might actually hurt free market competition and might hurt European consumers. One interesting case study was when earlier this year when the company in the railway industry, Siemens, was trying to acquire Alstom, but that was prevented by the European Commission. So I guess my question is that what the European Union is that the dilemma the European Union is faced with, or is there any other option? Thank you.
Thank you. And was there one more? No, I think that's it. So why don't we go back? But we'll add maybe one as well, and if everyone could just react to one of those. But we haven't really talked about Russia, obviously. With the president last night basically say, bring it on in terms of election interference in 2020. But I guess the Russia question, and we've two on Central and Eastern Europe that I think are very important as well. But the Russia question is, a new president comes in generally trying to find some grounds for cooperation. That seems very unlikely to happen on this occasion because of, if it is a Democrat, because of Putin. So what is sort of the long-term future for the U.S.-Russia relationship? Is it just sort of managing this rivalry, or is there any sort of longer-term objective? But Tori, if we could, I'm not necessarily posing that Russia question to you, I think, but maybe Central and Eastern Europe, I think in particular, I think two very important questions on that. But what should we make of what's going on in Central and Eastern Europe?
Well, just to say, I think one of the distressing aspects of this period is that the administration has found a lot to admire in the strongmen of Hungary and Poland, and has largely exacted no cost for the rolling back of judiciaries, free media, dissent, etc. Interestingly, as was stated here, in Poland, the opposition is doing better at pulling itself together. It didn't do as well in the European elections as it might have. But the other point that's important here when you look at the gains that have been made, and I think they're modest but not insignificant in Slovakia, in Romania, etc., you're looking less at this rollback of democracy, and you're looking more at the oligarchization of politics. So what populations are objecting to is taking a different page from Putin's playbook, which is that the key leaders get to own the economy, get to put their friends in the media companies, get to squeeze out private enterprise, and get to be as corrupt as possible. And that speaks to bad governance. It speaks to the elites scraping the cream from economies that ought to be growing. And I think you could have that kind of a reaction here and in other parts of Europe as well. But the key aspect of democracy, that the pie grows for everybody and that the government is by the governed, needs to be reestablished and needs to be fought for. So, I think that's a whole aspect of this thing that needs to be highlighted, that these folks often are making themselves great again rather than making their nations and their populations great again.
Thanks. So let's maybe just go down the panel. So Walter.
Well, on the question of Russia, I think what we're seeing is that Putin, who is really trying to rebuild the ruins on the ruins of Soviet power and reconstitute Russia as a great power, one of the assets that the Soviets had developed was intelligence, disinformation. They had a lot of links in a lot of places, and Putin very quietly and very successfully began to reactivate them. Everyone laughed at Russia today when it began to start. They weren't afraid to fail as they tried to push forward. And in lots of ways, largely because Putin is very good, Putin and the people around him are very good at reading our illusions about ourselves and our hubris and ways in which we've made rhetorical commitments which in reality we're not willing to live up to, was able to exploit the space between the West's image of its power and strength and the actual facts. And in that, a weaker, poorer power was able to inflict one humiliation and defeat after another on much stronger powers. And this continues to be a technique that he is very good at using. And again, our lack of self-knowledge is often his greatest asset. However, it's also true that nothing works forever, that pendulums swing, and you develop a set of successful ways of manipulating politics, and so they don't work as well when they've been exposed, or the third effort doesn't work as well as the first. So I think it's a mistake to think that Putin is stronger than he is or more capable than he is. There are severe limits for him too, and there are ways in which he can be countered. But I do think that the idea that everything was just great in the United States and then this horrible Putin came in and now we have Trump and everything stinks is a way of avoiding the fact that things could not have been in good shape for there to be a place where even potentially his intervention could make a difference. Something was wrong. And it's more important to think about that, I think, in terms of strengthening here and in Europe for the long term, than in sort of saying, well, Putin's the reason everything is bad, let's just fight Putin. Yes, let's. But let's also think much harder about what makes our societies strong and where our illusions do give him an opening.
Thank you, Constanza.
But I think that's the lesson of Putin, or it's two lessons really. One, faraway powers can with ease become actors in our own spheres, not just in Venezuela, but within the American domestic polity. And secondly, they exploit pre-existing vulnerabilities. And in so doing, they hold up a mirror to us. In the same way that I would say Trump also holds up a mirror to Europe. And I think it behooves all of us, forgive me for using this very old-fashioned verb, it would be a good idea if all of us were to consider very seriously those vulnerabilities and do something about them. And in fact, I think that is something we could and should have a transatlantic conversation about. I am frankly terrified by the casual disregard for representative democracy that appears to have become a fashionable undertone of some of our current political debates, whether it's about climate change in Germany or in this country, or the conversation that some of you may have noticed, the new office in the State Department that is supposed to make sure that human rights are based on natural law. I'm a lawyer, and I know exactly what that means. It's an attempt, yet another attempt, to roll back human rights in the way that we understand them by suggesting that the current understanding of human rights is somehow secular, progressive, and thereby sort of against the values of sovereign and strong states. That is ridiculous. And I think we need to recognize these things for what they are and make sure that we protect the achievement that our domestic constitutional orders constitute. We have never been so free. We have never been so prosperous and so stable. But if we have become destabilized, it is because we have failed to invest in the maintenance and upkeep of these orders.
Thank you, Ben.
Yeah, I want to react to Nicolas' question on EU competition law, because I think it's a very interesting example of whether the European Union is able to go from being a market to a political power. That merger was prevented because currently EU law protects consumers, and it's all about ensuring competition and not about competing in great power competition and having industrial giants that could be, protect European sovereignty. And so we are seeing a little shift in the conversation about this. I mean, at the same time, it seems that the front runner to head the European Commission is Margrethe Vestager, who's the person who prevented that merger. But I think it's really key. So that's a good example. In the same respect, there's been a lot of backlash here and coming from the administration about PESCO and the European Defense Fund and some of the, let's use the word, protectionist measures that are taken right now by Europeans to promote their own European defense industry. And I think it's necessary. There's no other way for Europeans to invest in their own security and defense, as the last two American presidents have so forcefully asked them to do, if they can't at the same time do it by promoting their own industrial base, which means restricting third-party access. So these are things that are anathema to the traditional European liberal, open society, consumer-driven DNA, but they're necessary, I think, to emerge as a political entity.
Ben, thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of the panel, Ben, Constanza, Walter, and Toria.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.